Hi, welcome to History 1302. This will be lecture number 9. I'm your professor, Clayton Cahan Lust, and we'll be talking today about the 1920s and a so-called return to normalcy. This is not the phrase that's associated with the 1920s. The 1920s, in fact, represents a decade where there are a ton of symbols associated, a ton of images, and normal is probably the last one that most people would think of. Now, following a world war, most people thought there would be a return to normalcy, but that just didn't happen. Among the images that the 1920s had associated with it, we had bootleggers and marathon dancers and flappers and so-called G-men who were going out and interdicting alcohol that was being produced in the United States. We also are going to see the rise of a new consumer culture in the United States. But the 1920s was also a decade of deep cultural conflict within the United States, nearly a cultural civil war, if you will. American culture was radically transformed over the 1920s with battlegrounds in the areas of race, ethnicity, modernity, radicalism, all across the board. There are massive changes in the United States. The consumer culture that we're going to see developing here, in large part, is pushed by Hollywood, magazines, and advertisers, and it's being done as a way to try to overcome some of this radicalism and some of this constant change over the 20s. So let's look at the development of this cultural civil war first. On May 1st, 1919, bombs were discovered in the United States as mail. They were being delivered to prominent capitalists across the country, like J.P. Morgan, as well as to American government officials, including the offices of the Supreme Court. In June, a number of bombs were exploded in 8 cities across the country. On September 15th, 1919, a bomb went off on Wall Street contained in the cart of a peddler. This wound up killing 30 and injuring hundreds of people. And the suspicion in each one of these cases was that the people behind it were quote unquote alien radicals, that these were people who were bent on destroying the power centers of the United States, people who'd come in from other countries who were doing all of this stuff. And these helped set off a fear in the United States that came to be known as the first Red Scare. Now, when Americans were talking about this first Red Scare, Americans weren't kidding around when it came to repression. They had already seen the Espionage and Sedition Acts of the World War I era. So they were perfectly willing to go out and go after people who had different types of beliefs. For example, a person in Indiana who was of Central European descent, he was a clothier, and he said, quote, the hell with the United States, and he was shot and killed. A jury found the suspects not guilty over this because of his unpatriotic utterances. A clothing store clerk in Connecticut had written about Vladimir Lenin of the new Soviet Union, and said that Lenin was, quote, the brainiest of all world leaders, and he wound up being sentenced to 6 months in jail for writing this in a public forum. In November of 1919, members of the American Legion, let me try that again, members of the American Legion, attacked the Hall of the Industrial Workers of the World and lynched one of the IWW leaders. This wound up leading to a massive conflict and wound up putting the IWW out of business for the foreseeable future. We'll talk more about that in just a few minutes. The repression that's going on here is also going to lead into the government halls of the United States as well. In May of 1919, the House of Representatives refused to seat a man named Victor Berger from Wisconsin, who was duly elected from his district. And the reason that Congress refused to seat him was that Victor Berger's political party was the Socialist Party of the United States. The House of Representatives has the right, the power under the Constitution to determine their own membership. And they said flat out, we're not going to seat anybody from the Socialist Party. And as a matter of course, they vacated his seat when his district held a new election to replace somebody in that seat, they simply said, we're not going to be told by Congress who we vote for. And they once again voted overwhelmingly for Victor Berger. And Berger once again was refused his seat. Ultimately, Berger said that he wasn't going to continue to fight this fight and chose to actually run for the Senate from Wisconsin in 1920. Very simply, the reason for that, for going to the Senate, was the Senate didn't have the same power in terms of choosing their membership. In New York State, the state legislature there acted similarly. They removed all socialists from their seats, which had the effect of banning the Socialist Party in the state of New York. All of this culminated in a series of raids that were known as, quote, the Palmer raids. They were named after the Attorney General of the era, a guy named A. Mitchell Palmer. A. Mitchell Palmer claimed that he was removing the country, or, quote, ridding the country of, quote, the moral perverts of communism. Now, he said communism, but it's worth pointing out here that in the 1920s, in this first Red Scare, red meant communists. It meant people who were anarchists. It meant people who were labor union activists. It didn't just mean, quote, communists. It was a red was a term that was applied broadly across this country, and the effects were pretty big. It led to the imprisonment of more than 4,000 people in the United States under suspicion of violating the Espionage and Sedition Acts. There were 556 people who were deported simply for their political beliefs. And even with this concerted attack on radicalism, the Socialist Party still got 1 million votes in the presidential election of 1920, which is really a remarkable showing for that era. Now, the tool that law enforcement is using to carry out this Red Scare is the Espionage and Sedition Acts from World War I. And a lot of people were more understanding of the use of this tool during World War I. However, they had a much different opinion of all of this post World War I, which is why the 1920s were so contentious on some level. There just wasn't the same belief, the same solidarity behind the Espionage and Sedition Acts in peacetime that there was during wartime. Now, while the Socialist Party of the United States suffered a great deal, there were other groups that suffered a lot during the post-World War I era from this type of repression. Labor unions were a huge loser in all of this stuff, losing all of the ground that they had made up during World War I. During World War I, there had been an unprecedented wave of strikes in the United States. There had been a shortage of workers, a demonstrated shortage of workers, and the workers that were actually there started striking for better wages. They started striking for 8-hour work days. They started striking for maximum working hours. All of these things that they knew they could get by withholding their labor during a labor crisis. And their thought was very simple. More is being asked of us, so more needs to be given to us. And World War I did something that was really kind of unprecedented in the United States. It did temporarily, anyway, shift the balance of power to labor in this country, but it was a temporary shift. It did not last. This is not England. We don't have a labor party in this country that was going to wind up standing up for labor unions. There's no tradition of labor in this country where that sort of stuff is going to have a big hold. So while these gains were made, they did not stick around. By September of 1917, the United States Department of Justice was going after labor union leaders as they did with the industrial workers of the world. As I mentioned, in 1919, they wound up getting attacked by members of the American Legion. When that happened, and the workers in the IWW headquarters responded to this attack, they were the ones who were actually thrown in jail. One of their leaders was a guy named Eugene Debs. And if you go back a couple of slides, you'll see that there's a picture of Eugene Debs on a campaign button. Eugene Debs ran for president in 1920 from his jail cell. He had been jailed during this period of labor repression. He was literally one of the first people jailed under the Espionage and Sedition Acts. By the 1920s, labor unions were broken virtually across every industry. And it was not until pretty late in the Great Depression that labor unions actually recovered. So labor is going to be one victim of this so-called Red Scare. Women and feminism are going to be two more sort of victims of this repression. World War I, the stated reason for the United States fighting was to, quote, make the world safe for democracy. But a lot of people in this country, especially women, argued that literally half of our population, it's illegal for them to vote. Forget the, sort of extra legal repression we've talked about regarding Black voters. Women still couldn't vote for the most part in this country. So a lot of feminists argued that if we're going to make the world safe for democracy, we kind of need to step it up at home and make that rhetoric match what our actions are here at home. So a lot of people got behind the 19th Amendment, supporting the right of women to vote, including the President of the United States at the time, Woodrow Wilson. He supported this measure, even though he had previously said this issue needed to be left up to the states and needed to continue to be left up to the states. He supported the 19th Amendment because of this idea of having our rhetoric and our actions meet together. Now, the assumption was, especially for progressives like Wilson, was that women were going to be naturally, by their inherent nature, they would be progressives, that they would wind up being a sort of an easy group to count on their votes. But it turned out that women, just like every other group in American electoral politics, they had their own interests. You couldn't simply look at them and say they're monolithic, that all women believe the same things and all women vote in a block the same way on these things. So they weren't as dependable a group as the progressives believed. And as a consequence, there was again an attack on women and on feminism in this country. In 1922, the Department of Justice came out arguing that the women-led PTA, the Parent Teacher Association in the United States, needed to be disbanded, and their rationale was that the PTA, the national PTA, had ties to the Communist Party in Russia and was obviously taking their orders from the Soviet Union. Therefore, they were a communist-backed organization. Now, the feminist movement itself in this country also began to disintegrate over the idea of an equal rights amendment in this country. There had been all sorts of questions dating back to the 19th century about whether women should focus solely on the right to vote or whether they should press for an equal rights amendment. Now, back in the 19th century, women believed that, or feminists believed that once women got the right to vote, all other issues would solve themselves, that you've got the right to vote, now you can vote in like-minded people. But the reality was in the United States that that didn't actually happen. So the question was, for feminism, do we need an equal rights amendment or not? Some women believed they don't need an equal rights amendment. The 14th Amendment to the Constitution provides equal protection under the laws, so we don't need an equal rights amendment. Other women argued that no, we absolutely do need an equal rights amendment because the 14th Amendment thus far hasn't really protected everybody's rights. So there's all sorts of infighting over that. But what helped to push this destruction of feminism, at least the second wave of feminism, was the new consumer culture that's on the rise in the 1920s. Guys like Edward Bernays, pictured on the board, was a very prominent advertising executive during the 1920s. And he came up with these ideas for this consumer culture about glamour and sex appeal and stressing those over all sorts of other issues. Writers like Sigmund Freud suggested that feminists were quote unquote latent lesbians, that they were covering up who they actually were. And this new attitude emerged that suggested women needed to find fulfillment through marriage as opposed to going out and marching for political freedom. This idea kind of reemerges. There'd always been this idea that women found fulfillment through marriage and child rearing as opposed to political activity, but it kind of rears its head again. And this new consumer culture reinforces all of this stuff. Edward Bernays, for example, was the epitome of this sort of stuff. He came up with a campaign to get women to smoke, for example. He referred to these various cigarettes as quote unquote freedom torches, as a way of convincing women that they should smoke, that it's their patriotic duty to consume certain types of products. And he also convinced the cigarette industry to produce slimmer cigarettes that had filters so that they wouldn't taste a certain way, so that they'd be a little bit more hygienic to smoke, as opposed to the filterless cigarettes that would get little bits of tobacco in your mouth and force you to spit and all of that sort of stuff. So Bernays is really behind all of this sort of stuff. Now, it should not surprise you, and I hope it doesn't surprise you, to find out that Edward Bernays had a lot of psychological training and was able to come to this stuff almost sort of naturally. I say sort of because it doesn't just kind of pass from generation to generation like that genetically. But Bernays's uncle was Sigmund Freud. So it shouldn't surprise you to find out that these two guys were sharing information and sharing ideas and putting this stuff, this new idea about the consumer culture out there. Now, if we look at cigarette ads during this particular era, there is a very conscious effort to push women to smoking, suggesting the various health benefits of it. There's a push toward the patriotic nature of smoking cigarettes. So there's a huge element of that. There's an element of embracing the feminine culture as opposed to a feminist type of culture, one that suggested that what women ought to be doing is making themselves look as best as they can so that they can attract the husband and go off and live this sort of very domestically oriented life. And magazines like McClure's would be filled with ads for things like kiss-proof makeup and onyx hosiery as a way of saying, look, if you don't know how to make yourself look better, here are the things that will help you do this. And then also there was a conscious push toward hygiene and cleanliness. And they, again, kind of created a conjunction between the feminine world, the domestic world, and this idea of the importance of hygiene in things like Kotex products and the Eden washing machine, the supreme achievement in electric washing machines. The idea was very simple. This is how you find fulfillment. This is where you find fulfillment. In the case of the Eden washing machine, you find it at home. And what you need to do as a woman is go out and get one of these, or better yet, have your husband go out and buy you one of these machines. So there's a very conscious push to get women out of the political and back into the house, back into the domestic sphere, where a lot of anti-feminists believed that's where they belonged in the first place. Now, another battleground that we're going to see during the 1920s is the battleground over alcohol and the production and consumption of alcohol. On January 16th, 1920, the United States, quote unquote, went dry. Every single brewery, every distillery, every saloon, every bar in the United States was shut down. All of these things happened because groups of progressives that were led largely by women, like Carrie Nation and the Anti-Saloon League and the Women's Christian Temperance Union, all of these groups were at the forefront. And the reason they were at the forefront is very simple. The thinking was, just like when we talked about in the very first lecture of this semester, the thinking was that men squandered their money by drinking, that men who consumed alcohol beat their wives and their children. They ruined the whole domestic sphere. So women on some level had the moral high ground when it came to opposing alcohol. But prohibition wasn't just a women's issue. Big industry in this country became convinced that workers that consumed alcohol were bad, unproductive workers. If you eliminate alcohol consumption for the crime and punishment and law and order people, the thought was if you eliminate alcohol consumption, you eliminate crime in this country. The same logic was used on the war on drugs in the United States in the 1980s. But prohibition was also possible in large part because of World War I. German families owned the bulk of the breweries in the United States. Among the top 3 breweries in the United States, Anheuser-Busch, Miller Beer or Miller Brewing Company, and Pabst, the Pabst Brewing Company. All of these companies were owned by German families. Now, they weren't first generation German families by this point. They were certainly people who had been here for a couple of generations. But the idea here is they've got German sounding last names. And if you remember in the World War I lecture, there is a concerted effort to go after anything that represents German culture. Now, this industry tried to fight back. Anheuser-Busch, for example, led tons of bond drives to buy war bonds for World War I. They paid higher taxes than virtually anyone in the country, the alcohol industry did. And it really didn't make a difference because when these companies pointed this out, that we buy a lot of war bonds, that we pay a lot of taxes, that we're basically funding the war effort, prohibitionists simply shifted gears and argued that what they were doing was not only a war measure, but they also used it as a thinly veiled attack on Catholics and immigrants. During the 19th century, Protestants drank a lot. American-born Protestants drank a lot. The average American, native-born American, drank 7 gallons of pure alcohol per person per year. Now, that was up until about 1820. Starting in 1820, that percentage the numbers start to go down. By the time we get to the 1850s, it's down to about 3 gallons per person per year. Over the course of the 19th century, as the consumption of native-born Americans declined, the consumption of immigrants simply remained static. It was a simple matter of immigrants to the United States had not gone through any sort of temperance movement. They'd not gone through an anti-alcohol movement in their countries. So when they came to the United States, they simply continued consuming at the same level. So their consumption was more noticeable. It was more conspicuous. But what this also did, almost by default, it turned alcohol consumption into a quote unquote immigrant issue. It was in part about keeping cultural traditions together. It was in part about differentiation, and native-born Americans used it as a tool to attack immigrants. Now, that's all about temperance, but prohibition is about banning all of this stuff. Prohibition is about passing laws that ban something. And the prohibition law that gets passed and winds up getting codified in the 18th Amendment was worded in a very peculiar way. The 18th Amendment said, quote, after 1 year from the ratification of this article, the ratification happens in 1919. After 1 year from the ratification of this article, the manufacture, sale, or transportation of intoxicating liquors within, the importation thereof into, or the exportation thereof from the United States and all territory subject to the jurisdiction thereof for beverage purposes is hereby prohibited. Now, whether you realize it or not, this prohibition law has some gigantic loopholes in it. Now, one loophole is actually fairly easy to see. It's the very last sentence: for beverage purposes. Things like sacramental wine, that's not for beverage purposes. Things like the wine that Jews drink on the Sabbath evening, That's not prohibited. That's not for, quote, beverage purposes. That's ritual purposes. So that's not at issue here. But look again at what it says. After 1 year from ratification, the manufacture, the sale, and transportation of intoxicating liquors. Manufacture, sale, transportation. Ask yourselves, and I'll give you a second, ask yourselves, does that include consumption? Look at the law, look at what it says. The answer is no. It says nothing about consumption. So think of yourself as an enterprising person in 1919, or just somebody who likes to have a drink now and then. After 1 year from the ratification of this article, so they're telling you in 1919, you have 1 year to stockpile as much of this stuff as you can, because possession is not illegal and consumption is not illegal. All that's illegal is manufacture, sale, and transportation. That's it. Nothing else is illegal. Now, there's also the question of, does this mean only distilled beverages because it says intoxicating liquors, or does it mean wine, beer, everything? And Congress's interpretation was it's everything. Okay. But there were court cases brought to question all of this stuff. Now, the problem here is this. In terms of how that law was written, it's written with huge loopholes. Plus, the people who advocated prohibition believed that Americans would simply obey the law. Americans are law-abiding people. So if we pass a law against something, people will obey it. So when it came right down to law enforcement, forget the law itself being passed. The law enforcement in this country was very difficult. It was haphazard. For example, the government hired 2,500 agents to enforce the law through the Treasury Department. They hired 2,500 people to engage in law enforcement activities for the entire nation. It simply wasn't enough. Places like Indiana went beyond the law. They banned hip flasks and martini shakers. Other places said, we're not going to enforce the law because it's a federal law, not a state law or not a local ordinance. It's up to the federal government. So there were all sorts of pushbacks against this, as well as people who went the opposite way and did more than the law intended. But look at, for example, New York State to just see how effective, or rather ineffective, this stuff was. In the entire state of New York, over this period, 7,000 people were arrested for violating the 18th Amendment, or the Volstead Act, as it was popularly known. 7,000 people arrested for violating this law. Only 17 people were convicted. That's a terrible conviction rate. And the reason is prosecutors could not prove that people were violating the sale, the manufacture, or transportation. All they had a lot of people on was possession or consumption. The Treasury agents who actually entered a place called the 21 Club to search for alcohol were fired. They wound up being fired for what they were doing because they simply could not prove sale or transportation. Incidentally, what the 21 Club did to get around the laws was they charged a user fee for people to come in, or a cover charge, basically. And they said, once you're here, you can consume anything that's on premises, because if we sell you a drink, we violate the law. But if we tell you, yes, we've got alcohol here and we've charged you an entrance fee, and that entrance fee entitles you to consume, we haven't broken the law here. They were able to argue this successfully over and over and over again. As I mentioned, a number of states, especially northern states, passed laws that banned the enforcement of these laws because they said it's the federal government's problem, not our problem. So there's a huge issue in terms of how effective this is going to be. On top of that is the government, the national government, simply not doing enough Forget the number of people they hired from as far as law enforcement agents. The government spent $5 million. And this is contemporaneous. This is in 1920s currency. They spent $5 million on enforcement of all of this at a time when one expert said that the government needed, a contemporary expert said that the government needed to spend about 300 million on law enforcement. So this simply was doomed to fail. So was it successful? Well, on the one hand, you can look at it and say there was a short-term success. Death rates from alcohol related causes and alcoholism itself dropped by 80%. However, there were secondary effects like people going blind from drinking what was called bathtub gin, 50,000 people dying from contamination, paralysis wound up being widespread as a consequence of this because people were, quote, cutting the alcohol with virtually anything to make it stretch. There were people who would make this sort of, quote, home brewed liquor. They would make moonshine essentially, and then they would cut it with things like paint thinner. They'd cut it with rubbing alcohol. They'd cut it with gasoline, so it was, you know, twice as flammable. They even cut it with things like horse urine, which was discovered when a prospective buyer took his sample of alcohol to a lab and got back the chemical analysis, got back a note that said, "Congratulations, your horse is pregnant." So all sorts of things were going into this stuff that made it completely unsafe to consume. So it's obviously dangerous. It's obviously problematic. But does it make people stop drinking? And the answer is no, it doesn't. People turned to bootlegging to make money. It became part of the American culture almost. For example, Cleveland, Ohio. Cleveland, Ohio had 1,200 legal bars before Prohibition was put into place. But after Prohibition became the law, there were 3,000 illegal bars, or what were called speakeasies. So the number of bars literally doubled in Cleveland, Ohio alone. Al Capone's organization, an organized crime outfit, made $60 million a year on alcohol-related things alone. So what difference does all of this make? Well, Prohibition changed American drinking habits. Up to this point, up until Prohibition happened, America was a nation of beer drinkers for the most part. But during Prohibition, Americans became a nation of hard liquor consumers. Second big problem is that Prohibition fostered massive political corruption and contempt for law. And it's a really easy thing to say, you know, well, yeah, there's organized crime, which I think everybody knows there was organized crime. But think about that issue about contempt for law for a second. Even if you truly believe there's nothing wrong with alcohol consumption, or there's nothing wrong with, because consumption's not illegal, there's nothing wrong with selling the people what they want. Just by taking that position, you are advocating breaking the law. So a lot of Americans were doing it. A lot of Americans were consuming this illegally produced, illegally transported alcohol. And they simply said, well, you know, this is what we do. This is what we want. And there's no harm in it. But they are, by definition, lawbreakers now. That's kind of a hard pill for Americans to swallow. And yet Prohibition remained. It could not be enforced. It bred law enforcement contempt, but it was not repealed until 1933, when the government, in the midst of a deep depression, started looking for any way to create jobs, and they used alcohol to do it. Now, incidentally, before we move on to race, so sorry, I'm going to step back for a slide for a second here. There were parts of the country that very strongly favored Prohibition. The more rural parts of this country supported Prohibition, believe it or not, because alcohol was associated with all sorts of things that they hated. They didn't like immigration. They didn't like progressivism. They didn't like the rapid urbanization that was going on. So they used alcohol as a rationale to attack those sorts of things. This doesn't mean that rural parts of the country necessarily opposed alcohol consumption. It's simply a symbolic opposition on their part. And the reverse is also true. In urban areas, they tended to oppose prohibition because it was everything that they looked at and saw. They too saw it as something that was wrong with the United States. It was a backward thinking way of doing things. It attacked immigrants. It attacked their own culture. What's wrong with a person who has to go to work for 15 hours a day, coming home and having a drink? Why is that necessarily being turned into something illegal? So they too had a symbolic problem with all of this stuff. Now, our third battleground in the United States of the 1920s was race. Some of the most vicious racial violence took place between 1917, the tail end of World War I, and 1923. World War I had produced a massive migration of African Americans from south to north. This is sometimes referred to as the Great Migration. They came in African Americans came in large numbers to northern cities as factory workers, sometimes as strike breakers. Large northern corporations had organizations that would actually go south and look to recruit African Americans to bring to northern cities, while southern cities frequently responded with violence against African Americans as a reminder that no, you don't go northward, you stay here where your place actually is. But even as African Americans moved northward, thinking that things were going to be different, it turned out things weren't necessarily different. African Americans became targets of white violence in the North. They were ghettoized in the North as much as they had ever been in the South. And we see race riots and racial problems happening in places as dispersed as Chicago, Washington, D.C., Houston, Texas, and Tulsa, Oklahoma. Tulsa, Oklahoma was probably one of the more famous of these racial incidents. Tulsa was the economic center of Black America. It was once called the Black Wall, or the Wall Street of Black America. But in Tulsa, Oklahoma, a group of Tulsans decided that they had had enough when there was a story of a phony story, by the way, of a sexual assault in a department store in downtown Tulsa. A young African-American teenager was accused of assaulting a white customer in the store, and Tulsans simply decided that's enough of this equal treatment and this Black Wall Street stuff. They made an attack on the Black section of Tulsa, killing hundreds. They destroyed 40 city blocks in the process. They destroyed 1,000 homes. The photograph that you see on the screen here, a few semesters ago, a student asked, why it looked like there had been bombs dropped on this area. And the reason was very simple. A lot of crop dusting planes were utilized in dropping Molotov cocktails and homemade bombs on the Black section of Tulsa. So it was a complete destruction. The newspapers were involved in all of this stuff. The newspapers in Tulsa, Oklahoma ramped up the violence, encouraging people to go out and go after African Americans. African Americans were attacked while police stood by and watched and did nothing about it. The end result was the complete annihilation of the Black population of Tulsa, Oklahoma. In 1920s census, the Black population of Tulsa was 12%. It was 12% of the total population. By 1930, when the new census was taken, the mark in the census book was 0. Now, that doesn't mean that literally no Black people lived in Tulsa, but from a statistical standpoint, it was 0, which means that it was less. Tulsa, Oklahoma was less than 0.5% Black. So this population had been incredibly successful, incredibly well-to-do, and had been completely driven out of the city. Another area where we see this complete annihilation of a population is a much smaller town, Rosewood, Florida, which is near the Florida and Georgia line. that borderline area. There were 150 African American residents in Rosewood, Florida. There were rumors, which once again turned out to be untrue, that an African American male had raped a white housewife. There was a massive search for the guy who supposedly perpetrated this crime. Since it was a made-up accusation, obviously no one ever found the guy who supposedly committed the crime. But this led to a rampage throughout the black section of Rosewood. When it was all said and done, only one house in the black section of Rosewood, a house that was owned by a white person and rented to a black family, that was the only house in that black section of Rosewood that still stood. 21 African Americans had been lynched, and whites were coming across from the Georgia border to participate in the carnage. It was incredibly ugly in all of this stuff. Now, this is one of these things that we think of. We think of this type of racial violence as a Southern issue, but this is not the case. Racial violence isn't just a Southern issue. As I mentioned, there are race riots in places like Houston, Texas, which is kind of Southern, but also kind of Western. Tulsa, Oklahoma, obviously is not Southern, it's Western. Chicago, Illinois had a massive race riot that had to do with children swimming in quote unquote segregated lake waters in Chicago. So this is really an ugly circumstance. In some cities like Chicago and Detroit, the black population increased by 300%. So there was bound to be some sort of friction. Under the best of circumstances, that type of change is going to create a little bit of friction. And these are certainly not the best of circumstances. So when African Americans started getting attacked during this era, there's again a response, a community response of sorts, if you will. There is this moment where African Americans push back, and we're going to deal with the third strategy that I talked about in, I think, lecture 3, when we talked about accommodation and confrontation. I mentioned that there's a third strategy called separatism. And I said at that point that all you needed to know right now is separatism means creating a separate enclave. That literally means what it sounds like. And that we wouldn't be talking about it in depth until the 1920s. Well, we're in the 1920s now, so now we're going to talk about it in depth. The strategy of separatism was led by a guy named Marcus Garvey. And Marcus Garvey had a completely different idea with separatism than Booker T. Washington with his accommodationist principles and W.E.B. Du Bois with his confrontationist policies. Now, if you remember back then, I talked about how accommodation and confrontation are simply two different paths, but ultimately they're headed to the same end point. It's going to end up with integration, okay? But separatism, as the name suggests, that's the goal of that is not integration. So right off the bat, this is going to be different, okay? Now, when Garvey starts this, Garvey is from Jamaica, and he rejected notions of integration from the beginning of this movement, said we're not looking for integration. In fact, he told his followers that there's nothing to be ashamed of, there's nothing to be fired up about integration. He said, for example, that all of the historical figures of the Bible, okay, people like Jesus, people like Moses, a lot of these figures, they were people from an area where the bulk of the population is brown, not Anglo in appearance. They're not white. They don't have blonde hair. They don't have blue eyes. They don't have the same quote unquote Anglo features that these biblical figures are portrayed as having. So he said there's a very good chance that people like Jesus, that Moses, all these other people, pharaohs from certain parts of Egypt, they were unquestionably, as far as Garvey was concerned, they were unquestionably black or likely to be black. He also sparked something different with an idea called Pan-Africanism, that people of African descent should revel in their African heritage. They shouldn't be ashamed of who they are. They shouldn't, for example, do things like straighten their hair. They shouldn't buy skin lighteners. In fact, in the pages of his newspaper and magazine that he ultimately started publishing, he banned advertisements for hair straighteners and skin lighteners, unlike the newspapers of the NAACP, the magazine, The Crisis, for example. They didn't ban these sorts of things, but guys like Garvey said, why are we hiding who we are? This is what makes us unique. This is different. It's worth preserving that sort of stuff. The idea of Pan-Africanism was really important to all of this stuff. Pan-Africanism is more than just, we're in favor of, all Black people banding together. It's a much broader issue. What Garvey was suggesting with Pan-Africanism is that people who are African Americans, people who are Afro-Canadians, people who are Afro-Brazilian, people who are Afro-English, wherever, if you're from Africa, you're being discriminated against in the same way in virtually all of these places. So all people of African origin need to band together in support of all African people. So Afro-English people need to support what the struggle is for African Americans. And they also need to struggle or support the struggle of anti-colonialism in Africa, the freeing of these people from colonial European rule. So people in Kenya, African Americans and Afro-Brazilians and Afro-Canadians and Afro-English people should be supportive of Kenyan nationalism in East Africa, that they should be freed from English colonial rule, things like that, that they're all kind of in it together. They're all being oppressed wherever they are, so they all need to support each other wherever they are. Now, in 1917, Garvey organized a group specifically to push these principles of Pan-Africanism and separatism forward. This group was called the Universal Negro Improvement Association, or UNIA. Now, the UNIA claimed to have 1 million members across 7,000 different branches. It was a massively successful movement that did create this separate enclave for African Americans in the United States. It operated separate grocery stores, separate restaurants, separate clothing stores. It even operated a steamship line called the Black Star Line as a way of saying, don't give your business to white entrepreneurs, give your business to Black entrepreneurs. And Black people who are entrepreneurial, help serve your community. Don't serve the broader community. Strive to serve your own community. Okay. Now, this movement probably had closer to 250,000 members as opposed to the 1 million members that Garvey claimed. But regardless of that, whether it was 250,000 or whether it was 1 million, Garvey had demonstrated with the UNIA that it was possible to organize large numbers of African Americans around an idea that did not push for integration. This was a really important idea here. Now, at the same time that Garvey is enjoying success with the UNIA, there's another group that is going to emerge here in the United States, or reemerge is the proper word. They're going to reemerge as a way to counter this ascendant African American sentiment, and that is the new Ku Klux Klan. Now, the Ku Klux Klan's origins are in the post-Civil War era. After the Civil War was over, leading whites in the American South, in the former Confederate States, created this organization. They initially started it as a sort of veterans benevolence group, but it morphed very quickly into a terror organization to try to intimidate Blacks from casting ballots in new elections after the war was over. The United States national government had succeeded in, for the most part, suppressing this organization. The first anti-terrorism laws in this country, for example, were created to push down the Ku Klux Klan. And by the time the 1870s and 1880s had passed, the Ku Klux Klan was largely irrelevant in this country. Okay, but by the 19 teens, a whole new Ku Klux Klan had emerged. And there were two key factors in the emergence of this new Ku Klux Klan. One was a film that we've already talked about, The Birth of a Nation. This movie, as I pointed out to you before, portrayed former slaves running amok throughout the old Confederacy, just kind of raping and pillaging and terrorizing the community until the heroic Ku Klux Klan arrived to save the day. The president of the United States, as I mentioned, gave sanction to this movie, and it became a huge recruiting tool. Now, that combined with the hiring of a public relations firm in Atlanta cemented that this Ku Klux Klan, this new one, was going to be different. They were far more savvy to what was going on in the rest of the world. Just hiring a public relations firm demonstrated that. But this jump-started their membership. They went from a group of just over 3,000 to a 5 million person strong movement by the time 1920 rolled around. And the reason for this, the reason the numbers grew so dramatically, was members got a rebate in other people's dues just by signing up new members. So the more people you sign up, the more money you make. It's kind of like a big pyramid scheme, and unapologetically a pyramid scheme. And it worked so well. It was such a broad-based movement that 16 senators from the United States Senate, that's fully 1/5 of the US Senate, they were members of the Ku Klux Klan. Dozens of members of the House of Representatives were members of the Ku Klux Klan. A president of the United States, Warren G. Harding, was actually inducted into the Ku Klux Klan while he was president, and it happened at a ceremony that was presided over at the White House. Just utterly remarkable how out front this new Ku Klux Klan was. If they had been taken as a political party, the Ku Klux Klan controlled the legislatures of 24 states in the United States. So regardless of political party, the Klan was a big deal in this country. And think about this. There's 24 states I've mentioned here where the legislatures are controlled by Ku Klux Klan members. That's fully half of the country. So this isn't just a Southern thing. This is a big national movement. And probably the best example of this group of people was a guy named David Stevenson. David Stevenson single-handedly exemplified what the Ku Klux Klan, this new Ku Klux Klan was. This new Ku Klux Klan claimed that they were not, quote, they weren't simply anti-Black. They were, quote, anti-Catholic. They were anti-Jew. They were anti-immigrant. They called themselves the defenders of old-time values. So they also attacked people like divorcees, like wife beaters, and alcoholics. And David Stevenson was an organizer for this group. Stevenson had always been an unremarkable person. He had worked odd jobs throughout most of his life, but he really found his niche in the Ku Klux Klan. He organized, which in 20 different states, which made him a ton of money just on that. He also rationalized that members of the Ku Klux Klan needed, quote unquote, a robe and a hood. So he became the exclusive supplier of robes and hoods to the Ku Klux Klan. And he was just spellbinding by all accounts when it came to, talking about the Ku Klux Klan. He attracted 200,000 people at a rally in Kokomo, Indiana. He called himself, he used the words, defender of prohibition and womanhood in talking about himself, which meant, of course, that he was a heavy drinker and a womanizer. In 1925, Stevenson almost single-handedly destroyed this new Ku Klux Klan by kidnapping and attempting to kill an Indiana librarian. He was convicted, and that conviction had devastating effects on membership drives. The numbers of new members started to level off. They started to decline. And by the time the 1930s rolled around, the second Ku Klux Klan was basically in complete disarray. Now, again, the Ku Klux Klan is going to reemerge in the 1950s and the 1960s. According to the Justice Department, the Ku Klux Klan is now on its, quote, 6th iteration, but its importance lay in it being a sort of catch-all for any sort of white supremacist group. So it's more of a term. It's kind of a term like Xerox uh, is used in place of photocopying machines today. So that, instead of saying, well, this is the white supremacist group that has this big long name, they're a KKK group. So that's where the Ku Klux Klan's legacy lay today. Now, our next battleground is going to be on immigration. And the two avatars, if you will, are these two immigrant anarchists named Niccolo Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti. Sacco and Vanzetti were accused of a double murder in 1923. There was an exceptionally weak case against both of these men. They both had alibis. Neither one of them spoke English, and yet somehow they had both written out confessions to what they did. One of them was actually armed, but at the time that this double murder occurred. However, even the evidence of the day, the physical evidence of the day, suggested that the bullet that killed the two victims didn't come from the weapons that Sacco and Vanzetti were carrying. So there was no physical evidence that linked them to this, simply a fear of immigrants and a fear of foreigners. Even during their own lifetime, there was a sense that what Sacco and Vanzetti were on trial for was less the murder of a payroll clerk and his driver. They were more on trial for their political beliefs and their immigrant status. Both were Italian immigrants. Now, despite the problems of their confession, despite the lack of physical evidence, ultimately Sacco and Vanzetti were executed in 1927 in this double homicide. And the reason I say that they are the avatars for this anti-immigration sentiment is very shortly after they were arrested and they started to be put on trial, Congress jumped into all of this fray by passing a series of acts that are collectively known as the Immigration Act of 1924. Now, there's a whole series of laws here. There is no one piece of legislation called the Immigration Act of 1924, but there's a whole slew of legislation that collectively gets put under this banner. I've picked some of the most important of these laws as part of this curriculum. I'm not going to ask you to remember all of them. But the first big part of this was that ethnic groups could come to the United States each year at a rate of 2% of their 1890 population. Their 1890 population is important because there simply was very little Eastern and Southern European immigration to the United States before 1890. So if you put immigration rates at 2% of the 1890 population, that means people like Sacco and Vanzetti will not be the type of people emigrating to the United States. They're going to be consciously kept out of the country. Another part of the Immigration Act of 1924 was the banning of all Asian immigration, period. There had been an act in the 1880s referred to as the Chinese Exclusionary Act. Well, this new act in this series of legislation added people from Japan and the Philippines to this Chinese Exclusionary Act. So it basically became an Asian Exclusionary Act. Also, it specifically stated that a person who was of Asian descent could not become a citizen even by marrying an American citizen. So there was, again, a concerted effort to keep people of Asian descent out of the United States. And then the final part of this banned the entry of all quote unquote aliens who were ineligible for citizenship. Now, the reason that was done was there were a lot of immigrants who came to the United States as what were called birds of passage. They would come to the United States, they would make money and make enough money to do whatever it was they were trying to do, to give their families some stability, to buy land back home, and then they'd go home. They would not stay. But banning aliens ineligible for citizenship meant that people who had been convicted of crimes, people who were guilty of violating things like any sort of immigration restriction of some sort, they were now ineligible to even come to the United States. Forget maybe at some point get naturalized. They were banned from simply coming to the United States, period. So there's a concerted effort in the United States after the arrests of Sacco and Vanzetti to make sure that people like Sacco and Vanzetti from these different parts of the world, who hold different types of political beliefs, who speak different languages, who have different customs, make sure that those people don't come to the United States. Now, a fourth battleground in the United States during the 1920s is the battleground of religion. And in this case, it involved the argument, essentially, between fundamentalists and modernists. Now, this is a relatively new argument in American history, this problem between religious fundamentalists and religious modernists. Prior to the Civil War, most Americans did not believe that there was a conflict between science and religion. In fact, most American Christians believed that science reinforced religion. But the thing that changed everything, I mentioned that it's before the Civil War. It's not the Civil War that changes things. Right before the Civil War happens, in 1859, a guy named Charles Darwin published a book called The Origin of Species. And in that book, he detailed his theory of evolution, that the world and the species evolve independently. They don't have God influencing this. There is no God creating things going bing, 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 bing. That's not what's happening, according to Darwin. Okay, all sorts of species are evolving constantly based on their interactions with nature. And when this happened, American Protestantism split into two distinct camps. The first group was called the modernists. They believed that religion must change to accommodate established science, that if something is found that scientifically refutes what was in the Bible, essentially, they say, well, science matters. The science is more important. These people, it's important to understand, modernists did not reject the Bible entirely. Rather, what they argued is that the Bible, in most cases, is a metaphor, and the Bible is for the most part a literary work, which doesn't mean it's unimportant. They still accepted the fundamental philosophical ideas embodied in it, but they simply said this is not a work of history. It's not a work of science. Now, on the other hand, you have a group called the fundamentalists. The fundamentalists, again, look at things a little bit differently. They rejected science for the literal truth of the Bible. If the Bible says that God created the heavens and the earth in 6 days and then rested on the seventh, then that's how it happens. That's how it happened. There's no room for interpretation. If the Bible says that God made woman by taking the rib from Adam, that's exactly how it happened. It's not a metaphor for anything. The story of Jonah and the great fish, it's not a metaphor for anything. That's literal truth. It's exactly what happened. Okay. They got their name, the fundamentalists, because they published a series of pamphlets referred to as, quote, the fundamentals, which spelled out their basic belief system. Now, it's worth pointing out here again about as far as this being a social conflict within the United States, fundamentalist groups tended to be more popular in small towns in the United States and in rural areas, but they also tended to be a little bit more visible in their nature as well. Now, these two sides came together in battle, if you will, in a cultural battle in 1925 in a case called the Scopes trial, or as it was more popularly known during the era, the Scopes monkey trial. In Tennessee, the state had prohibited the teaching of the theory of evolution in their public schools. And in 1925, in Dayton, Tennessee, a man named John Scopes attempted to teach the theory of evolution in a class in which he was a substitute teacher. He was arrested for teaching it. He was jailed for teaching that theory. And the ensuing thing that happens is the Scopes trial. The attorney for John Scopes was a man named Clarence Darrow, who's pictured on the left of your screen. Darrow had gained fame as a prominent defense attorney during this era. He was the defense attorney in the first case that was referred to as, quote, the crime of the century, which involved the first successful insanity plea as a defense for murder. The state of Tennessee had, for its part, another prominent American assisting them, a guy named William Jennings Bryan, the guy pictured on the right. For those of you who are wondering, yes, it's the same William Jennings Bryan who ran for president, talking about the cross of gold and all of that. Now, Bryan was a self-appointed expert on the Bible, which is why he offered his expertise to the state in helping prosecute John Scopes. In a very highly unusual move, Clarence Darrow, during the trial, Clarence Darrow, the defense attorney, actually called Bryan, a member of the prosecution team, to the stand as an expert witness, and then essentially ridiculed him throughout his testimony. But the ridiculing is not the big point. The point is that Darrow got William Jennings Bryan to admit under oath that parts of the Bible are meant to be taken metaphorically, not literally, which kind of undercut the state's case. Now, ultimately, John Scopes pled guilty and was fined $100 for all of this sort of stuff. But the case underscored the bitterness of the fight between modernists and fundamentalists. By the way, it turned out that this was a well-concocted publicity stunt by the people of Dayton, Tennessee, although they didn't let everybody else in on all of this stuff. So from the outside looking in, it looked like a legitimate trial, which is why it caused so much cultural strife in the United States. So we've got all of these cultural battlegrounds, which are, in terms of radicalism, in terms of alcohol consumption and law enforcement, in terms of race issues, in terms of immigration, in terms of religion. All of these things collectively are tearing the United States apart during this era, making it very difficult for the United States to appear to be one way or another. One last story about what this cultural battleground brings, or what this cultural fight brings the United States to. The Democratic National Convention of 1924, brought together the white conservatives of the South, big city ethnic peoples from all sorts of parts of the country. There were Catholics, there were Jews, there were Christians from the South. All of these people had to find a candidate that appealed to everybody in this mishmash of a group. There was one side that defended the Ku Klux Klan, said they are completely legitimate. Another part of the Democratic Party that said, no, the Ku Klux Klan is terrible and we need to ban them from our party. They split on that. There was a motion before the Democratic National Committee to condemn the Ku Klux Klan, to say that they're the bad guys. It failed by a vote of 542 to 546. So they were practically split down the middle on all of that. There were two candidates in the election of 1924. There are two presidential candidates. A guy named Al Smith, who was the governor of New York, who was an Irish Catholic, bitter opponent of the Ku Klux Klan, opposed Prohibition. And the other was a Southerner named William McAdoo, who was the exact opposite of Al Smith, an opponent of progressivism, supported the KKK, supported Prohibition, all of that stuff. The KKK staged a rally outside of the convention of 200, and there were 25,000 people in this KKK rally. There were votes after votes after votes for the candidate. And finally, on the 103rd ballot, the Democratic Party picked a guy named John Davis to be the nominee for the party. Now, don't remember his name. It was a worthless nomination. The Democrats polled 8 million voters in that election to the Republicans 15 million. They were destroyed. The Democratic Party nearly got destroyed as a consequence of this cultural civil war. It would take a huge crisis to bring the Democratic Party back from the dead. And since I'm saying that, and since you should all be aware of this right now, that pretty much everything I say at the end of these things is about foreshadowing, that means there's a big crisis on the horizon. So come back for lecture 10 and we'll see what that huge crisis is. Thanks. See you next time.